All right, bear with me as we get this mic set up here. This is like old school with the paper clip. Yeah, I like it. All right. Well, hey, y'all. Thanks so much for having me out. Is the mic all right? I hear a little bit. Okay. Yeah, I have never yet been to an organic or Austin Organic Gardeners meeting, but it's so good to be here for the first time. Yes, I'm definitely squarely in the farming community here. And I'll talk to you a little bit about my farm and also what I do with Johnny's Seeds. But just to show of hands, how many of y'all are familiar with Johnny's Seeds? I know, okay, I see lots of hands. Okay, it's good. I'm glad I don't have to start from the very beginning explaining where I'm coming from here. So, all right, let's see here. All right, so Verdant Farm, this is me. I started Verdant Farm just 3 years ago. We're just coming up on our third birthday here. So I am a 3.5 acre diversified vegetable farm in Bastrop, Texas, which is just 45 minutes east of here. I run about 100 plus member CSA and I do seasonal wholesale. And yeah, we're a female owned and operated biointensive farm. So I know a lot of folks have questions about what biointensive means. Basically, my practices are organic. I just haven't gone through the certification process. So I talk a lot about biointensive being biologically driven and not chemically driven. So just like talking about that beautiful poem of just the interconnected nature of farming, that's really the perspective that I come at running my farm through.
I'm going to turn this so they can see your face.
Oh, but thank you. Yeah. Just getting I'll remember to talk to the camera and not just to everyone here. And then just a little bit about Johnny's Seeds. So my role with Johnny's is I am the regional sales rep for Texas and the Southwest. So I mostly work not so much with gardeners. I wish I got to work more with gardeners day to day, but I work with just the big commercial farms in the region, kind of helping them match what they need on their farms to what we sell at Johnny's. So that's super fun. And I love working for Johnny's because we are a 100% employee owned company, which just means everybody on the team is really just like bought into the success of not only the company, but that also translates to the farmers and the customers that we're really serving. And so our mission is, let me see if I can actually zoom in a little bit here on the computer so I don't have to look away. So our mission at Johnny's is to really help communities feed each other. So, you know, that goes from gardeners all the way up to farms. And, you know, something that I think is really neat about Johnny's and what I've always loved, not only from being a customer, but now working with Johnny's, is that everything is really, really research driven. I'll show you our research farm in the next slide, but absolutely, you know, everything that we grow, we've trialed on the farm, and we also are breeders. So we're also breeding vegetable varieties that are really for small scale growers and for, you know, commercial hobbyists and things like that. So yeah, this is a picture of the research farm in Maine. I travel out there pretty frequently to Maine to see all the trials in the field. So we have a 200-acre organically managed farm out there, and we plant, you know, everything side by side, all our pepper trials, all our melon trials, you name it. We're planting everything side by side and only selecting the varieties that we think are the most competitive, best yielding under organic conditions, et cetera. So that's where really the selected in the Johnny's selected seeds comes from, is the fact that we go through this rigorous testing process. And Johnny's has always been really, really committed to organics. That's why our entire research farm is organic. And all of the varieties that we're choosing perform well under nutrient stress. So, you know, maybe not all these chemical inputs, but yeah, working within the organic system. So not to be too much of a Johnny's salesperson, but just so you guys know where I'm coming from, you know, I just want to own, before I get into this whole conversation about seeds and and varieties for the South that, you know, there's so much regional knowledge. There's so many varieties that are probably in each of your backyards that are adapted to this region or are really awesome. Today, my talk is definitely coming from a little bit of a commercial farming perspective, and as someone who's in, you know, the seed industry and in the breeding industry. So, you know, a little bit more focused on maybe the high tech stuff and the stuff that's coming out for commercial agriculture. But that's definitely not to like discredit or discount any of the, you know, heirloom seeds or varieties that you guys might have and be stewarding in your own backyards. I'm just talking about what I know, and what I know is commercial vegetable farming. So hopefully something I have to say tonight will be useful to you in kind of y'all's journey as gardeners. So the first thing I just wanted to talk a little bit about was seeds and genetics. And I don't know how nerdy you guys want to get, but this is what I do day in and day out. So before we kind of dive into, you know, specific seeds and varieties, I just wanted to give a little bit of an overview on seed storage, how to keep your seeds viable, and then also talking a little bit, just disambiguating some of these terms of like hybrid seeds versus open pollinated seeds, things like that. So that's where we're going to start. So I'm sure a lot of y'all know this, but you know, different types of seeds have different shelf lives. And so this chart here is given under optimal conditions, and that's a caveat there that we're going to talk about a little bit more in the next slide. But under optimal conditions, you know, each one of these different types of seeds has a shelf life. So just for example, you can see that alliums, things like leeks and onions, they have a very short shelf life of only a year. So, you know, for me as a commercial farmer, and also probably for y'all as gardeners, you might not want to buy a lot of allium seeds and hold them year to year. You know, you probably only want to buy enough for that year, plant them, and just know that they don't store well. So it's not really, you know, worth planting seeds that aren't going to be viable the next year. Whereas some other things like, let's look over and see, you know, cucumbers have a much longer shelf life. So it might be fine to, you know, buy some extra cucumber seeds and use them the season or the season after. And so those are the storage, and if you want any of this information, it's all on the Johnny's website. I can point y'all there. So this is the average storage life when under favorable conditions. And favorable conditions is low temperature and relative humidity. And this is actually really, really important for us here in the South, because I think we all think about temperature, so we might keep our seeds in the refrigerator. But one of the biggest mistakes that I see on commercial vegetable farms is I'll go in and I'll be like, okay, farmer, where do you keep your seeds? And then they'll take me into their produce cooler, which has really, really high relative humidity despite having low temperatures. And so the rule of thumb is that the relative humidity and the temperature sum should never be more than 100. So that's really important, because we're going to head to our next slide here, which is basically a graph of seed storage and viability. And this graph is taken from, I think, foxglove research, but I think it still illustrates very well the difference. So right here, this is the germination, and this is the, oh, you can't see my cursor on the screen, but basically you can see that things, the yellow line is a much higher much lower relative humidity. You can see only a 20% relative humidity. You can see that the storage period lasts 5 years, whereas you have a 70% relative humidity is going to be the gray line, and at a 70% relative humidity, the seed viability was not even 6 months. So just that really impacts, the relative humidity really, really impacts the viability of the seed. So what I suggest, this is what I do, and it's what I suggest y'all do, is actually, you know, a lot of big commercial farms will have dehumidifiers and a whole setup to keep their seeds fresh. But even just as simple as buying a plastic box that, you know, is airtight, you know, locking, and then you can pull out the silicone pouches from your, you know, your supplement bottles, or even you can order them on Amazon, but that is just going to help absorb a little bit of that extra moisture. So even putting those seeds in the airtight container with that silica moisture absorber and then putting it in your refrigerator, your seeds are going to be good for a really, really long time. So that's just the inside scoop from a seed salesperson on how to keep your seeds really fresh. And if you're keeping it in that zone, then you should be getting those time frames that you saw in the previous slide. You know, some seeds you can keep up to 6 years. Some, again, like alliums or other things, are only good for a shorter period of time. And not to get too into it, but seeds actually really are, this blows my mind because I just learn about it more and more every day that I'm working, is like, seeds are these little living things. They kind of have, it's not like a heartbeat, but there is a certain amount of respiration that each seed has in it. And so when it's at like a high relative humidity and a high temperature, it's almost like its heart is beating a lot faster, it's respirating. Whereas when it's at that low relative humidity and low temperature, then it's like a slower heartbeat. So it's not a heartbeat, but I think you guys get it. It's respirating. And did I see a question back here? Okay, I'll keep going here. So I did just want to take a moment and disambiguate some of these terms around what is a hybrid, what is open pollinated, what is GMO. A lot of these terms can be a little bit scary, but just wanted to kind of work through it so we understand what it means when we look at a seed catalog. So open pollinated varieties are varieties that produce seed true to type if they're allowed to cross-pollinate with other plants of the same variety. And so I think a lot of us are familiar with this. If we have a population of an open pollinated plant and they, you know, cross-pollinate with each other, the offspring are going to look pretty similar. And, you know, there is variation through time, but generally they have those same characteristics. An heirloom crop is really just an open pollinated crop that has been stabilized for over 50 years. So it's basically just saying a really old open pollinated crop is an heirloom. And there's a few more specifications for what an heirloom is, but just to boil it down. And then a hybrid seed. This is the hardest one to wrap your mind around, but a hybrid seed is traditional breeding technique which crosses two inbred parent lines to produce a more uniform, vigorous offspring. So I won't go too deep into this. If you guys are curious about it, Google it later. There's lots of videos out there that will explain to you the genetic Punnett squares. But I just want to make sure that you understand that hybridization is really, you know, you are inbreeding two lines, so you're selectively breeding them, but it's definitely nothing transgenic. You're just doing traditional breeding the way you would a chicken or a pig or a horse. You know, this is stuff that Mendel could have done with his peas. It's just much more drawn out process than an open pollinated variety. And the reason that hybridization is really powerful is it often lets us introduce completely new genetic traits into, you know, genetic lines. So something like you have a pea and it's a really good producer and we love it, and then we want to add a new disease resistance. So what we might do is have two kind of inbred parent lines. One has the disease resistance, the other has the characteristics that we like. Then we put them together and we get this like super plant that we really like. And so, in the next slide, I'll show you an example of what hybridization looks like, but I just wanted to make sure that everybody understands that it's traditional breeding. There's nothing transgenic, nothing weird happening there. And then when we get, so basically that's what traditional breeding is. It's just crossing plants with relevant characteristics that, you know, are compatible. Then GMO or transgenic breeding is adding new genes or parts of the genome to the crop, to a plant. So that's taking, you know, genetics outside of that plant and, you know, shooting it in, or, you know, now there's a lot of talk about what CRISPR is and what that means, but I just want to assure you guys that Johnny's does not dabble in anything GMO. We've always said that that was like not our deal. You know, we're not judging it. We're just saying we don't sell any of those seeds. So if that's not y'all's deal, which I'm assuming since you're organic gardeners, it's not your thing either. I don't plant any GMOs at Verdant as well. So yeah, we don't knowingly sell any GMO seeds, but that's just a little bit of a breakdown of what all those different, I guess, yeah, classifiers are for breeding types. So just wanted to talk a little bit about sort of the pros and cons, because you might be like, all right, open pollinated, heirloom, hybrid, but like what's better? And what I can say is there's not necessarily an answer. like, each have their pros and cons. So hybrids, they're usually much more uniform. Just again, if you guys want to do that genetic deep dive later, you'll see why. But, hybrids get ready all at the same time. They're extremely uniform. They usually have a higher yield, but you can't save the seed from hybrids. Just because of the way they recombine in the F2 generation, you can't do that. So open pollinated seeds, they are less expensive, but they usually have the less disease resistances just because of the way they're bred. It's usually faster to get disease resistance into hybrids. But you can, pros of the open pollinated is you can save seed generation to generation. So if that's something you all like to do on your farm, then open pollinated is the way to go. And just one thing that I like to always say is just because a crop is open pollinated, like a seed is open pollinated, doesn't mean you're necessarily getting the same quality of seed just because it has the same name. Getting high quality true to type open pollinated seed is really, really important. So for example, with any hybrid variety that you get, if you get it from Johnny's Seeds or you get it from High Mowing Seeds, it's going to be the same hybrid variety because it's like patented and it's produced a certain way. But when it comes to open pollinated varieties, there's really nobody saying this is what this is. So, one company might be saving that seed and producing it, and it might be drifting genetically in one direction. And then another company might be saving that seed and it might be drifting in another direction, because in open pollinated varieties, there is what we call genetic drift, and that's why a lot of people save seed on their own farms. And so a few years ago, I used to be the farm manager at what used to be Johnson's Backyard Garden, and we were growing we were growing okra, and it was the same type of open pollinated okra. We planted it in the same flats at the same time, and it went out in the field, and a portion of it started fruiting a month before the other stuff did. And I was racking my brain. I was like, what went wrong? Why is this other okra not fruiting? Checked the fertilization records, checked everything. And what it ended up being was that it was actually seeds from two different companies. And one of them was doing a much better job with selecting the okra crop that was sooner fruiting. And the other company probably just wasn't thinking about it and was just letting whatever cross-pollinate. And so there was a clear distinction, even though both the variety was clumps and spineless. One seed did much better than the other. So just to put that out there, that just because you're using open pollinated seeds, that's one of the things that I love about Johnny's, is that we actually get the same open pollinated seeds. We'll get the same clumps and spineless from 10 different vendors, and we'll grow it all out on our farm. And we'll say, okay, this vendor is the best, has the best okra, because it's not all the same. Even though it has the same variety name, especially the open pollinated, they are sort of like families. So they're a little different. So yeah, of course.
Variables do you look at? Is it flavor? Is it also fruiting?
Yeah, so the main thing that we're looking at is yield. Because flavor is so subjective, that's not usually something that we can make like a really definitive decision about. But usually what we're looking at is the harvest and the quality of the harvest. It just depends on the crop, but that's what we're usually looking at. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Any other? All right. Well, unless there are any other questions about seeds, then we'll start talking about the actual varieties and how I kind of think about crop planning and what to grow in the South. We ready for it? It's a quiet room. Vibe high? All right, let's jump in. So just a caveat here. I mean, y'all heard I went to school in upstate New York. And, I did my first farming in Iowa, and, I came from not a southern climate. And then when I moved here to Texas in 2014, it took me like a solid, I would say 4 or 5 years to really wrap my mind around the climate. And I'll just be honest about that, because I think we're all so conditioned. It's like, why is butternut squash in season in June here? Like, why, like the whole, strategy of growing and crop planting here in the South is like really different. And so I'm gonna just kind of talk to you guys about the varieties I like, but also about crop planting in the South. And I hope it's helpful for you because it took me years to figure out. So I hope, especially I see for some of y'all new beginners, I think it's nice, especially if you're coming from another place where the planting is kind of like you plant in the spring, you harvest in the summer and late fall, and then you have the winter off. Here in Texas, we have like 2 super short seasons where we have early spring and fall, and it's kind of like manic and year round. And I'll talk to you guys about it. So basically, in my experience, and this is just all my opinions, so don't take it as the truth, but in my bucket categories in my brain, there's sort of 3 types of southern adaptions. The first is just short season yield. Things that can yield really, really quickly are super valuable here because of our short seasons, and I'll talk about that. The other is just varieties and types of plants that are heat and light tolerant. And then the third bucket in my mind is things that are just like regional disease resistance. There's some diseases that are worse in this region than other places, so those would be varieties that I look for. So to be honest, the biggest thing that I've found, the biggest key to being successful to growing things in this region is timing. It's timing, timing, timing. We have such short windows to get things in and have them do the right thing. So as much as I would love to just sell you guys seeds from Johnny's and be like, these are all the best heat tolerant varieties, plant them whenever you want. To be honest, 80% of this is getting in at the right time. 20% of this is choosing the right varieties, I think. Would you agree with me, Steve? Yeah. So I don't know if y'all have ever seen this before, but the vegetable garden planting guide from Texas A&M, I find this chart to be quite, in the range. There's little things that I do differently than this chart, but generally I would say that this is in range. And so what you're going to see is you can kind of, again, I wish I had a pointer, but generally you can see there's a lot of red in January and February. So basically anything that's a little bit hardy, so can take a frost, we're going to be planting it January, February, and then everything that's tender that doesn't like a frost, we're going to be planting it March, to the beginning of April, and that is really our very narrow window for planting in the spring. You don't really see us planting anything in May, June, July, and that is because y'all who live here know that it gets hot as heck. So really, and I'm going to show you guys why this is, but really about after mid-June, plants are not really their photosynthetic activity unless you're planting things like okra or like really heat tolerant stuff. It depends on the variety, but a lot of times after the heat and light intensity are so much, the photosynthetic capacity of the plants can actually like taper off. If we're talking about vegetable production. So again, there are some things that we can plant through this window, but a lot of it is about getting it in early and about getting it in so that it produces before mid-June. So we'll talk about that. A lot of times I talk to young farmers about crop planting. So there's a few extra slides in here about like how to figure out when to plant the right things. So I mostly plant according to this guide, but for some things I do actually use soil temperature too. I don't know what y'all kind of use as that kind of like guiding principle, like especially in the winter, if I want to get an early crop of like carrots or beets in, I will go out and just use a little laser gun to measure the soil temperature, and that's a pretty good gauge of when you can start to germinate things. So you can find all the germination tables online of when things do better than others. I really like this book called Knott's Handbook for Vegetable Growers. It's pretty much an encyclopedia of everything you want to know about any vegetable crop ever. And I think if you Google around online enough, you can find like a free PDF version. So you can see, I like this table right here because it gives you the minimum and the maximum, kind of like the germination, but also the best growing temperatures. And just for super quick reference, you can see that the maximum growing temperatures there's not a whole lot of crops that like it above 95. So just putting out there that that's a little bit more supporting evidence for the fact that kind of when we get into mid-June, early July, plants just aren't producing as vigorously. This again, I don't want to overwhelm you guys, but I do talk to a lot of farmers about crop planting, and so I really like this little app, which is garden.org crop states. And I'll share this presentation with all the links in case you guys want to follow all these links. But this is just another thing that I use sort of in risk mitigation and crop planning, that, for example, when I'm thinking about how risky I want to be with planting something like broccoli, for example, which is kind of hardy, I would say I know that it can't survive under 28 degrees. So I might look at the last 28-degree frost and the likelihood of it, and, you know, plan accordingly to the probabilities on this chart. Again, maybe this is nerdier than you guys want to get, but a lot of times when I'm doing my crop planning, I like to kind of make my plan, and then I like to cross-reference it from multiple directions. So I might also double check the soil temp when I'm planting, and I might also check my probability for a frost, just to kind of make sure that I'm planting it at the right time. Again, I know this is a lot of science. I hope you guys knew what you were signing up for tonight. This is a graph of the basically the light energy that's coming out of the sky that plants can use for photosynthesis. And I wanted to just put this up here. This is a graph for, I think, Bastrop, so it's pretty much the same for here in Austin. But planting things, I basically just wanted y'all to understand that planting things in February, you know, the days to maturity don't necessarily, the days are not necessarily equal, because the day in February has much less light intensity for things to photosynthesize than a day in April. Actually, a day in April has almost twice as much energy that it's giving to the plant in order to photosynthesize and grow than in February. So whenever you are on a website and you're looking at the days to maturity, just kind of know that it is a suggestion. You know, the days in February have a little bit less energy, that I wouldn't quite say that they count for a whole day. And then, you know, actually as we get up into later April, you know, or May, things are just, you guys see it, they just grow so fast because of all that solar energy. And then of course, even though it peaks, the solar energy peaks in June, a lot of times that kind of is the point where it's so hot that a lot of the plants really struggle and can't necessarily use all of that photosynthetic energy. So again, this is a graph, that was a graph of the light energy, and this is a graph of the temperatures, the min and the max temperatures. So I've been kind of mentioning a lot that plants don't do well in the extreme heat, and this again is just a graph of how well plants photosynthesize on a temperature graph. And I drew a line here for 100 degrees. And so through our summer, it's 100 degrees, and you can see both C3 plants are like everything that we'd be growing. C4 plants are grasses. So, but you can see basically everything drops off after 100 degrees. And so you might be like, well, why does that happen? We have the most sunlight and plants eat sunlight, so why would they be slowing down in the peak summer? So a big part of the puzzle, I mean, there's a lot of factors that come into play. Some of it is just the enzymes in the plant, like, don't function well at high temperatures. So that's part of it. But then a huge part of it is actually that plants are breathing. And so when they have moisture in them, they're breathing through all their little stomata on their leaves. And when it gets too hot and they can't regulate their moisture, they basically have to close up shop. They say, oh, we're closing all the stomatas so we can't lose any moisture. But then when they can't lose moisture, they can't photosynthesize, because they need that inflow of carbon dioxide and, you know, outflow with the water in order to run that photosynthetic cycle. So again, this is the link to the place where this photo came from, and they have a great in-depth article about all the ways that heat affects photosynthesis if you want to do that deep dive. But basically what I'm bringing all this back to is, here in Texas, I feel like everywhere else when you're growing, you just look at the frost date and you just plant after the frost date and you go. Here in Texas, I find it's actually the exact opposite. I feel like I engineer everything to mid-June when I know it's going to be too hot to really grow, when it gets too hot to really photosynthesize, and I reverse engineer it. So I say, okay, potatoes are a 90-day crop and I want them to be out the beginning of June. So when do we plant them? You know, end of February, beginning of March. I actually reverse engineer a lot of my crop planning from the heat, not necessarily from the cold. Because the cold is really unpredictable for us and we can do a lot with minor covering, etc. But we know that the heat is coming and it's a really hard line. And so the first thing that I would say, and the most dramatic thing I would say for working with the heat in Texas is getting your stuff in early and, you know, getting it mostly established before the heat. So with all that being said, I'm going to get into a little bit of the actual varieties that I'm talking about here. So the first thing that I mentioned is just choosing the shortest days to maturity varieties for long season crops that are not necessarily heat adapted for the spring or cold hardy for the fall. So just a few things off the top of my head, and we can go into depth in your questions. But for example, green beans. I always grow the provider crop, and this is a variety that you can get with Johnny's because it's only 50 days to maturity. And green beans don't like it. I know you guys, a lot of you know this, that green beans don't like the heat. When it's too hot for them, they drop their flowers. So instead of trying to be like, I'm going to find the most heat adapted green bean, the most heat adapted green bean is just the shortest days to maturity green bean to get ready before it gets hot. So if there's not something kind of weird about that logic, I love the provider bean because it's ready in 50 days, whereas a lot of the other beans might be ready in 60, 65 days. So, you know, a whole 2 weeks shorter. And so, you know, you can't get them in until after the frost date in March, but yet you want them to be ready before it gets too hot. So choosing these shorter days to maturity varieties is actually, I think, one of the most powerful Southern adaptions, and that's easy. Y'all can all look in any seed catalog and find those short days to maturity stuff. So another like really fun one is I love the cauliflower song TJS 65. I should have included a picture, but it's an Asian cauliflower that is much more branching. It's like a lighter cauliflower, but it's only 42 days to maturity, whereas most other cauliflowers are 60 days to maturity. So again, it's an easy crop to get in, you know, in the spring here so that it can be ready to eat before it gets really, really hot in June. Same thing with snow crown. That is a traditional like white cauliflower, heavier head, 50 days to maturity. You know, same things with cabbage, short days to maturity. I mean, some storage cabbages are 120 days to maturity. You're never going to get that ready before it gets hot here. So, you know, for some of these crops that aren't super hot adapted, like okra, long beans, just choose the shortest ones. Get them in, get them out. And then acorn squash too. I'll talk a little bit more about that. But I always really struggle with like butternut squash and pumpkins and things because they're such long days to maturity. It's hard to fit them into our tiny little seasons. But the acorn squash, I love it because it's only 90 days to maturity, so you can get like a good hard winter squash crop in our short season. So those are just a few examples. I gave you some examples out of the Johnny's catalog, but when you're looking for short days to maturity varieties, just look at, you know, in any seed catalog, you can pick those out. Mm-hmm.
When you're planting at the end of February, are you planting in the ground or are you planting in flats to be transplanted?
Great question. So yeah, I'm planting in the ground. I would say mid-February to mid-March is my biggest planting season. And I start things in the greenhouse actually around Christmas time. It's like my favorite thing after Christmas to start seeding all of my peppers and tomatoes. So yeah. Any other questions about that?
Didn't we have like a hard freeze like mid-March?
We did, but you know, the amazing thing is the only stuff that I had out in the ground was brassicas. You know, I had cabbages, kales, broccolis, and I also had potatoes. And the potatoes had just popped up out of the ground, but they got nipped by the frost and they grew right back. And same thing, all the brassicas were fine. They took it and they kept on trucking. And I also had, you know, like some baby greens, but there's little things you can do to kind of like keep them a little bit warmer. And I have frost cloth and all that. So it is a little hard, but especially since that spring frost is so unpredictable, sometimes it comes mid-March and sometimes you'll never get one after February 1st. So I just kind of bite the bullet with risk at the beginning of the season, because if I'm going to lose it, I know I'm going to lose it to the heat if I put it in late. But if I put it in early and I still lose it to the frost, at least I can get in something else early. So, yeah.
Just keeping the ground cooler, like with mulches and things like that, how hot the plant gets.
Would you repeat the question for people?
Sure. So the question was whether or not keeping the soil cool helps kind of push that heat date back. And what I would say is, I mean, soil temperature is important, but more importantly is leaf temperature. And so you can push back that time by growing under shade. And so now a lot of commercial growers in Texas are starting to move towards growing in greenhouses under shade cloth in the summer. And that's incredibly effective. I'm also building right now some raised beds underneath the forest canopy, which I'm planning on only growing in the peak summer, because things like that, you know, kale could grow through the oak leaves and not be blistered. So yeah, and we'll talk about that more when we get to like peppers and things too, that the light intensity is part of the equation of what makes it difficult here. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Have you tried warming the soil in any way with a sheet of plastic, clear plastic or something, say in February or January, to get it warmer? Does that work?
Yeah, you could. I mean, obviously a warmer soil temperature helps, you know, speed up nutrient availability, et cetera, but I've never found that soil temperature in the winter has been a limiting factor. It's not like our ground really ever freezes. And, you know, I like to get things, you know, in the ground in, yeah, mid-February, even if the air temperature starts to plummet pretty quickly. I find that the soil temperature is warmer just because of the sun. I'm growing on sand, so that helps. Also, I'm growing on well water, so I'm bringing it up to like 60, 70 degrees when I soak it. So I don't find soil temperature to be a limiting factor. I also don't use like disposable plastic mulches on my farm, whereas some farms do. So that's just like not necessarily an option in my toolbox that I've chosen. Yeah. One more question?
Yeah, you keep talking about a soil temperature. What about purchasing a temperature gauge of some sort? Or what do you use to talk about calculate what the soil temperature really is?
Yeah, so that's a great question. You can buy probes that just sit in the soil. I'm a little bit more dorky, and I just bought like a $20 laser temperature that like you can buy it at like, it's not necessarily for like a human, but you can buy them at like Harbor Freight. They use them on a lot of like construction sites. Like if they want to know if a pipe is hot, but they don't want to touch it, you know, then it's just like, it looks like a little laser gun, and you just point it and it'll tell you the temperature of whatever you shoot at. So a lot of times I'll just walk around the farm, and it varies in different places. You know, in my waterlogged soil, in low-lying areas, my soil might be 10 degrees cooler. And then on top of the hill in the sun, it might be 10 degrees warmer. So if I'm deciding like, oh, where am I going to plant my cucurbits early season, I'm not going to put them in the low, cold, wet spot. I'm going to put them in the warm spot, you know, so because I know that's what they need. So again, that's a whole other conversation about knowing your land. But yeah, that's how I measure temperature. All right, let me take one sip of water here, y'all. Talking too much. Okay, so regional disease adaptation. The two biggest ones, you know, and obviously it changes. Folks in Houston deal with more fungal diseases and things like that, being closer to the coast. But I'll just speak to what I kind of know here in Central Texas, this area. The two biggest ones that I find are powdery mildew resistance, especially for cucurbits. I find that we have really, really high powdery mildew resistance, like basically mid-spring through late fall. And again, powdery mildew is just one of those things that's pretty endemic. It comes in on the wind. There is a lot that you can do to prevent it on your farm by creating, or your garden, sorry if I keep saying farm, by creating, good airflow inside your rows, not planting things too densely, not getting the leaves or keeping the leaves wet as much as possible. There's a lot that you can do to kind of prevent powdery mildew from becoming bad, but there's no way that you can prevent it absolutely. It does kind of come in on the wind. And so I find that choosing varieties that are powdery mildew resistant just sets you up to be so much more successful for growing cucurbits, both in the late spring and in the fall. I wouldn't, if you wanted to grow something that wasn't powdery mildew resistant, I think you could pull it off early season spring here. But again, once it starts to get hot and into kind of a later season, it's hard to grow things without powdery mildew resistance. So two that I really like, just from the Johnny's catalog, and again, pretty much anything, if you're looking in the catalog and you see it, PMR means powdery mildew resistance, that's going to be a better variety for you to grow in this region. But just two that I like, anything in the cucurbits family would benefit from this powdery mildew resistance. I really like our Renegade pumpkin. It's just got like stellar powdery mildew resistance and just had really great yields. And I know that that's sometimes hard to pull off, pumpkins in Texas. So this is one that I loved. And then I know I already mentioned the acorn squash, the Tip Top PMR, but it's ready in 90 days, which is a nice short crop for a winter squash. Most butternut squashes are maybe 120 days. And it's powdery mildew resistant. So I grow this in both the spring and fall, which is fun. That, we'll plant it in mid-March, April here in the spring, and then plant it in September for the fall. And I can usually pull it off before the frost. So those are some good powdery mildew varieties. The downy mildew resistance, this one was just absolutely crushing for us in the commercial sector, because downy mildew resistance has kind of evolved and kind of got ahead of our plant breeding for a few years. And so again, when I was managing big commercial farms in the area, we could not produce cucumbers in the summer here. Pretty much after mid-May, we were not producing cucumbers because of the downy mildew resistance until these two varieties came out. And they're both by the same company, and they figured out downy mildew resistance and are making a lot of money, because these are pretty much the only cucumbers that I have seen work consistently well now through like mid-May through the fall. And so as soon as these hit the market, when we switched over to these, it was like magic. It was like, wow, these cucumbers survived when all the others died. So I'm hopeful these two varieties, the Citadel and the Bristol, they've been on the market for about 4 to 5 years now. So I think some other companies will catch up with them soon and maybe give us some more options for downy mildew resistant cucumbers. I'm always kind of trying to stay abreast of what's happening with downy mildew resistant winter squash as well. So far there are none on the market, but I'll be the first to know when they are, so stay in touch. And then those are just the two main diseases that I see this area. There are obviously others, and we can talk about them if you want to, but I wanted to leave time to actually talk about what y'all were probably most excited to hear about in the first place, which is heat adapted varieties. Took me long enough to get here, right? So just a quick overview. I know most of y'all know this if you're gardeners, but there's just some crops that are just naturally really well adapted to heat. So things like okra. Any okra plant, that stuff will grow in 95-degree weather, 100-degree weather. Barely water it, you're going to grow okra. It works in the heat. All right. I would say most all eggplant also does pretty well in the heat. It's one of the more heat-tolerant crops. Peppers, if you choose one with a good leaf canopy, which is what we're going to talk about next. And same thing, tomatoes. They don't set fruit in the hottest part of the year, but we'll talk about that. But generally, these are crops that are more heat adapted. Things in the brassica family, they really don't do well over 85, 90 degrees, so these are not going to be things that the brassicas are not going to be things that you're going to be pushing into July and August. These are things that you can push into July, August, September. Cowpeas and long beans, excellent in the heat. We'll talk more about those. And then things that are, like I said, okay adapted. Oh, well, I had tomatoes on here twice, but melons, pumpkins, tomatoes. So we'll talk about each more of those a little bit. I wanted to just kind of start before we talk about all the hot season crops by just talking about bolt tolerant herbs. A lot of plants bolt when they get exposed to like extreme stress of some type, like a big hot flash, heat wave. That's when your cilantro or your dill is going to start to bolt. And so we're really at risk of that here in Texas with sort of like how it gets hot very fast. It can trigger a lot of plants into bolting early. And so I really like these bolt tolerant herbs for our region because, again, they're not really radically different from another type of cilantro, but other than the fact that they're bred to not flower so quickly. So again, just to draw on the experience from commercial production, but we were growing an open pollinated, I think it was Santo cilantro, and we only got 2 cuts before it would bolt and flower, which made it unsaleable after that. And then once we switched over to this Calypso cilantro, we were getting 4 cuts a bed of cilantro, so we actually doubled our revenue off that bed by just switching what variety we're growing. So, that's also important in your context as home gardeners. If you want that cilantro and don't have to keep replanting it every 2 weeks and don't want it to flower, then I would suggest checking out some of these bolt tolerant varieties. So the Calypso and the Cruiser are sort of the best we have for the cilantros. And then for the dill, the Teddy dill is the most bolt resistant one. I see a lot of people growing the bouquet dill. And if you want flowers, that's what to grow. But bouquet dill is actually bred to bolt quickly. So because it's bred for the flower, hence why it's called bouquet. So just so you're understanding some of those differences and selecting the variety that's going to do what you want it to do. So heat set tomatoes, this is another really important area for us. A lot of y'all probably know that when nighttime temperatures are above 70 degrees, tomato flowers basically drop. They don't fertilize and create fruit. So this is why we can have amazing tomatoes up to about mid-July here, and then a lot of times the yields do drop off significantly after that because it's difficult for the tomatoes to actually set the fruit. It's not that the plant dies, it's just that the flowers don't fertilize. So this is an arms race in the breeding world right now. We have some varieties that are better, that set fruit at higher temperatures a little bit longer, but whenever geneticists figure out how to take away that temperature limit, they're going to be very, very rich. But we haven't made it there yet. So the best varieties that we have right now, I would say, are Estiva, Grand Marshal, and Phoenix. And Estiva and Grand Marshal are 2 varieties that Johnny's carries. We don't carry the Phoenix, but the Estiva is a much smaller, almost like cocktail kind of size tomato, and it is supposed to be one of the most vigorous, long fruiting tomatoes. So if you like to cut your tomatoes back in the summer and then let them kind of regrow in the fall when temperatures drop again, Estiva would be a great variety because it was actually bred, I think, to be a greenhouse tomato for Spain. So it would have like a 9-month fruiting cycle or something through the winter. But that's where Estiva came from. And then Grand Marshal and Phoenix are much larger fruit sizes, determinate tomatoes. Estiva is indeterminate, and they have a much, they will set fruit at higher temperatures than most other tomatoes. So that is tomatoes. Another thing that I want to talk about is peppers with great leaf canopy. Have any of y'all, raise a hand, seen basically sun scald on your peppers in the summer? All right, I see a few hands. What that is actually is basically sunburn on your peppers, that the light intensity is too much and they're getting sunburned. So, the best way to fix that is actually selecting varieties with good leaf canopy. And so a lot of times this is actually a problem that Johnny's has with some of their Johnny's bred varieties that they're breeding in Maine. So they're not necessarily selecting for crazy high light intensity. And so this is me as the Southern rep. I'm like, hey, breed some leaf canopy back into your peppers. Like, we need it in the South. But we do have descriptions in the catalog of what has good leaf canopy and what doesn't. So that's just a good indicator for y'all as you're selecting varieties from the catalog. Look for that good leaf canopy because that's going to help protect you from the sun scald. And if it doesn't have good leaf canopy, then I'd recommend putting it under shade cloth if you can through the late summer. Or me, I actually just planted my sun scald. My peppers that have the propensity for sun scald, I just planted them in the shadiest part of my farm. So that's the cheap way to do it, in the shadow of the trees. So that's peppers. Just two varieties out of our catalog, the Olympus and the Ninja, I think are the best on the Johnny's catalog, but we definitely don't have, you know, the only good leaf canopy peppers. So I will now address my absolute favorite Texas summer crop is long beans. Who's grown long beans before? Any hands? Oh, I'm so happy to see so many people have grown long beans. I actually grew up in Southeast Asia, so I grew up eating a lot of vegetables that maybe weren't common to us here in the States. So in my mind, this was always what green beans were to me. So I was really happy that they grow so well here in Texas. Long beans are actually related to cowpeas, and so they're not related to like normal green beans in the same way. So they have much higher temperatures. And you know, the crazy thing is that I think the Johnny's catalog, I think, has this listed as like a, I don't know, maybe a 90-day crop or like a 80-day crop, but these things produce, if you can plant these in the middle of July and they'll produce in like 60 days. Like, they're nuts. So this would be one of the few crops, I think, like okra and long beans are the things that I'm like, you could plant those in mid-June, July, they'd be fine. So this is a super, super tough crop. And the bees love it too. They're like in there with all the flowers and pollinating. So whether for beauty or for food, it comes highly recommended. A few more crops that I just wanted to throw out there that maybe aren't necessarily in any major category, but just some favorites of mine. Broccoli, I definitely suggest usually just planting it super early, but this Green Magic, it's bred for the South and for heat, and so it sets heads much better in the heat. So I'd highly recommend Green Magic. It's a pretty common variety. You can get it from Johnny's or a lot of other places, but that is a proven winner for the heat. I love Astro arugula as well. You can also use open pollinated arugula, but Astro is just a slightly more bred subset of open pollinated arugula, and it's just the best baby green in the heat. Like, it will germinate still in like 90 degrees and still give you a good crop. So if you do want to keep pushing baby greens into the late season, I think Astro arugula is a really good candidate for that. Red boar kale, this again is just kind of a fun and weird thing that because of all the pigmentation in the kale leaves, that they it lasts a little bit longer than green kale in the summer. So again, if you want to play with the edges of the season, I love red boar kale for that. And then last but not least, I'm obsessed with daikon radishes. Not everybody loves them as much as me, but daikons, they just don't get quite as spicy in the heat. A lot of times planting the little baby radishes, they can just get so spicy here in Texas, like basically after now. But daikon radishes, they do get a little bit of heat, but they're definitely not as punchy because of the temperature. So if you like radishes, but don't love the heat as much, I would go for those. And so that is most everything I have to say about growing in Texas. I'm going to open it up to questions now. Yeah. Yes.
One of the things I've been noticing over the last 2 years or so is that I'm getting tomatoes in the store. When I cut the tomato open, it has seedlings growing inside the tomato.
Huh.
And some of them with green leaves.
Wow.
Anything about that?
I don't know about that in particular, but it's probably just that the seeds came to maturity and then are germinating inside of the fruit. It makes me a little bit weirded out that the fruit's not acidic enough to prevent that from happening. So it makes me wonder if it's not just being grown really quickly in a way that's not, you know, like a chicken with the breast so big it can't stand, you know, that's kind of what it makes me think of, but I can't say for sure, so.
The tomatoes you mentioned,
Mhm.
how do they taste?
I mean, a lot of flavor. Flavor is dependent on variety to some degree, but a much bigger part of flavor is actually the environment that the plant is grown in. You know, if you don't have good nutrients in the soil and that plant is stressed, the fruit's going to be flavorless. You know, if that plant is in great soil, it's getting what it needs, I think that fruit's going to taste amazing. So, you know, I think that all of these fruits have the potential to be delicious, but most of that is in the growing. Mm-hmm.
How many types of tomatoes will you grow during the year, and what's your favorite cherry tomato?
That's so hard. I personally really love this variety called Chocolate Sprinkles. It's like this striped chocolate tomato. And this is actually the first year that I'm not growing it because I'm growing a Johnny's variety called Bronze Torch, which looks very similar. So I'm really hoping that Bronze Torch lives up to the place that Chocolate Sprinkles had in my heart. I have not traditionally been a huge tomato gal. I get stressed out by summer crops because I can't plan how much are coming the way that I can with like lettuce heads. But that being said, as the Johnny's rep for the Southwest, I'm starting to do a lot more trialing. So this year I'm growing like 20 different types of tomatoes because I'm doing a lot of trials for the breeding team. And then I'm gonna basically get back to them about how all these different varieties performed in our region. So hopefully I'm gonna have the opportunity to help nudge the selection process towards the varieties that are favorable for our region. But because of that, my tomato patch is a little bit of a crazy zone this year. But I'll have you out if you'd like, Steve. You can come check out all the new varieties.
You sort of answered that, in fact, you are being a research farm for Johnny Seeds here in the heat.
I mean, just very minimally. Like all of the very structured trials are being done at the research farm in Maine, but there are certain things that they don't know how the peppers are going to respond to light intensity. So there are certain questions that they are seeking to answer through what we call grower trials. And so, you know, I am working with Johnny's to help find farmers to grow some of these new varieties and see how they work in our region. And I'm just kind of doing it too for fun. So. Yes?
I have two questions back to seed saving.
Yeah.
On your chart, it did show a temperature 10 degrees below zero. Does freezing seeds help, or is it more harmful in storage?
I don't think that chart did have below zero. I will say I don't think freezing seeds is helpful to their viability, but I do know that many seed banks can freeze them as a way to store them for even longer. I will say that freezing seeds is not something that we do in the commercial seed industry, and I couldn't really tell you the best way to do that. I would say, at least from what I know, keeping them at a very low relative humidity and reasonable temperature above freezing would be the best bet. Yeah.
And second question,
Mm-hmm.
Years ago, someone said they used rice
Mm-hmm.
as the desiccant in the refrigerator. And I thought, well, rice is also respirating, is that the word?
Mm-hmm.
It's a living organism. So would that work, or would it just add to the problems?
I think it could work. I know that rice is a very original desiccant, and I know that rice has been processed, like taking the hull off of it, is going to, like, I don't think that you could plant white rice and have it germinate anymore. So I think it could work, but I've never tried it, so I won't tell you for sure, but maybe get back to us on it if you do.
Question from Zoom.
Please help me. I was just trying to figure out how the chat works, so please help facilitate here.
So this last winter, this This is from Melissa. So this last winter, when we got our first freeze around December, it was 80 degrees the day before, and my kale died. Have you had any struggles with the extreme temperature swings the last few years?
Yeah, and that is super hard for us because it is much better for plants to gradually move down because they do develop sugars, their blood kind of gets thicker. I don't know if you've ever noticed the difference in flavor between winter kale and spring kale, but it tastes different because they have different levels of sugar in their tissue, etc., which helps them prepare for these freezes. So it is super damaging when you go from 80 degrees to, I think it was like negative something. Like it was crazy. So yeah, I mean, covering them as much as possible is amazing, but I would be more worried about my plants being exposed to 28 degrees after an 80-degree day than 28 degrees after it's been like 35 for a month or something like that, so yeah, hardening off, exactly. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And back to seeds for just a moment. You indicated airtight in the refrigerator.
Yes, sorry about that, y'all. I have an alarm going off. So the reason I say airtight is because you want to keep it as low humidity as possible. And so usually your refrigerator is a very high humidity environment. So the reason that we want to keep it airtight is so that you can put a desiccant in there and keep the relative humidity lower than your refrigerator.
Okay. And so that lack of air exchange doesn't harm the seeds.
It shouldn't, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Just one more on Zoom. Jill, she was wanting to know, she's a northern transplant, she's in Texas, and she's wanting to know a little bit more about cutting back tomatoes in the fall. And I know we've taught a little bit of this in other previous classes, how you kind of regrow your tomatoes when temperatures are favorable.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, just beyond tomatoes, I think most plants that are struggling through that heat, if you do cut them back pretty aggressively, it's just like taking things off their to-do list. Those tomatoes are just like hanging there being like, we have all of this plant matter, we have to keep hydrated and it's so hot, and they're stressed. And so by like cutting them back, they can kind of just like, okay, we got this. They can just kind of hang out. And then when the temperatures are favorable again, they honestly have like more energy to kind of like rebound and come back. And so the big thing is just making sure that whatever you're trimming back, you're leaving growing points to regrow. So, when I used to do like gardens for restaurants or whatever, like, yeah, I would intensively cut back all of the tomatoes. You can even cut back like eggplant and peppers when they get tired. You can trim them back to their nodes, and then they can, you can give them a fertilizer booster, some extra compost, and help them regrow for fall. Same can be done with like obviously the basils and so many herbs. I cut them back in that hottest part of the season. So. Mm-hmm.
Are you working on solutions for climate change that something that can help with adaptation?
Like on my farm or at Johnny's or at Johnny's. So I think at Johnny's we are definitely, trying to think in the breeding game, you have to be thinking really far ahead. And so there are a lot of things that you might not even like fully put together. In the seed industry, for example, last time I was at Johnny's, they are putting a lot of effort into breeding a new open pollinated carrot that's much more competitive and has good yields, because right now most of the carrots that we grow commercially are hybrid carrots, and hybrid carrot production is actually very difficult, and you usually have to do it in like 2 parts of the world, and because of like global supply chains and like all the other stuff that's going on, like we're very preemptive being like, oh, like maybe we should be thinking about having, breeding varieties that are going to be very competitive, but are actually open pollinated and easier to produce the seed, or a farmer could do it on their own farm if they wanted to. So, I mean, I guess that's not directly climate change related, but we are having conversations increasingly about drought tolerance, you know, about what we can do. But I mean, fundamentally, we believe that, you know, the more that we can really support farmers to be successful and feed our communities sustainably and locally, that is a solution to so much of the climate crisis. And so, I mean, Johnny's mission, like through and through, is just supporting the farms. You know, it's like, I think that we really see our impact as like through the farms, and that our mission is like to support everyone who's growing with, you know, the best knowledge, the best seeds, you know, the best support, so that they can be successful, and that y'all can be successful in all of your endeavors and what you're doing every day. Yeah, I mean, I think for us, I mean, obviously there's so much that we do on the environmental level. Like, that's why I'm a biointensive farm. That's why I'm a local farmer. You know, so much we're doing with, we cover crop, you know, every year, you know, about a half of our farm is cover cropped, you know, doing a lot to try to sequester carbon and keep our food local. But also from the other perspective, the context that I think about climate change, more than just my responsibility in mitigating it, is how this is going to screw me as a farmer. Because I am already feeling it, like just the amount of instability that I have to deal with as a farmer. Like, I, you know, lost everything last year. I lost a lot this year because of crazy weather. And so increasingly I'm thinking about how I can mitigate risk through, you know, not only through how I sell my products, but through what I'm growing. And so, you know, like this year, I'm installing a greenhouse to have more, you know, basically cold protection as well as heat protection. I'm planning on diversifying into mushrooms, which are not so affected by temperatures. They're in a climate controlled area because, you know, running the CSA, I need to have year-round production. I run it, you know, year round. I need to have at least, you know, 7-8 items to put in the box every week. And because of these intense weather events, it has made it challenging at times. So I'm thinking a lot more about redundancy and diversification. So yeah. Mm-hmm.
There was a follow-up question. We were talking about cutting back tomatoes.
Mm-hmm.
Tommy asked, does that work for determinate and indeterminate, or just indeterminate?
I would say it's going to work a lot better for indeterminate. Usually determinates sort of have that time clock where they put most of their energy into producing at once. So, I mean, you might, but I wouldn't recommend it. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So you talked about cutting back your tomato plants pretty drastically. So
Mm-hmm.
how much are you taking off? 30, 40%, 50, 60? How much are you putting away?
You know, I would say, I mean, do you have any answers to you? I would say like at least 50%. Like, yeah.
When I worked at the Austin Community Garden,
Yeah.
a great amount of excellent tomato growers. Celebrity was the big hit one.
Uh-huh.
We cut that down 3/4, we cut it down half, and then some of those gardeners rooted those tip cuttings. I went the opposite direction. I went with a determinate tomato and planted it by seed, because that plant that you would cut down half or 3/4, you still have to water.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And it's all about the water. So I took the same seed and grew it, and I got tomatoes quicker than any of those two other options. Obviously, the less amount of water is cutting, putting it in the jar. But I think it's just the summers. You know, some summers are 100 degrees and other summers are only 95. That's a huge difference.
Yeah.
I don't think there's any, you know, for a home gardener, you know, if you're going to consider doing that, just plant silvery fir tree tomato. I'm harvesting tomatoes now.
Mm-hmm.
Just that tomato alone grows, we can grow it here year round. Silvery fir tree. It is that was school gardening project.
I'll have to check out. Silvery fern tree.
I don't know if Johnny's has it.
We don't have that one, but that's all right. I'm embracer of all the seed diversity. Cool. Well, any other questions? As soon as the sun goes down as a farmer, I'm like, oh, gotta get to bed. I see the sun going down. I'm about to turn into a pumpkin.
Excellent. We really appreciate you coming.
Of course. I know all of y'all are gardeners and probably grow your own veggies, but